In no uncertain terms, I'm gonna blow your mind today. If you've played a game for any time at all, there's every chance that you've experienced said game's attempts to explain something to you, and you'd have short odds on those attempts being misguided and overall very sloppy. I'm not sure what it is about video games and those pesky tutorials that don't quite do their job correctly, and often play the role of an awkward stumbling block that hinders progress and halts momentum. Makes you wonder why developers bother in the first place. The prevalence of bad or just boring video game tutorials has got me thinking about how some games would look if there were no tutorials whatsoever. Would everything just fall nicely into place, or would we end up getting really frustrated at not knowing where we were at any one point? It's a fascinating look into how intuitively a game is made by asking one very simple but heavy question. How much help do you need? I'd like to add on to that most of the time we need tutorials. I like playing games where I can slowly crawl myself into a state of understanding every nook and cranny, but when you're playing something with intricate mechanics and layers upon layers of gameplay depth and complexity, I might need a push in the right direction every now and then. So that's the plan. I'll talk about some games with enjoyable tutorials that frame the knowledge they need to pass on in a positive way that doesn't make me want to get inexplicably violent. Who knows, maybe this will be a bit of an eye-opener to some who don't believe the tutorials can be fun. Sans Undertale is in Smash Bros. Now, don't you tell me what isn't possible. Do you know why so many people can't stand tutorials getting in the way of their video games? Because so few developers care enough to treat tutorials as anything other than an afterthought. So maybe the game is made as normal and then the dev team go back through it and place tutorials at just the right moments to ensure that new mechanics aren't too confusing. Or not, I've never made a video game before, and maybe tutorials are worked in organically as the game is made. Although I'll reserve my right to be incredibly skeptical until someone provides some hard evidence, since it certainly feels like no one actually gives a shit. Except for Call of Duty, ironically enough, because, you know, those games are churned out 24 hours a day until the apocalypse hits and we use second-hand copies of Infinite Warfare as currency. There's no way any of these would have a considerate tutorial, come on! Unless you find yourself playing the right one. Shooting a gun isn't a complicated action inside the seriously dumbed down world of video games, and therefore you don't necessarily need a tutorial in shooter games because it doesn't take much to convince someone to squeeze one of the trigger buttons. So every time I play a shooter that tells me how to crouch and sprint and throw grenades, my eyes, they roll into the back of my head as my spine seamlessly slips out of my anus as I can feel my time being wasted. Then again, we have Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, which absolutely doesn't need a tutorial by virtue of it being a sequel, but also they treat you like a veteran soldier who has to demonstrate combat skills to a group of rookies. And hey, this is still totally unnecessary, but I can appreciate how much respect the game gives you. You're not being taught this for the first time, you're actually using the knowledge you already have to teach others. We'll see a bit of this later, but I'm a little shocked that so few games have tried to do this, since it really does make you feel better about being forced to learn all this stuff again. Plus, the existence of this short tutorial allows you to get into the meat of the action straight away rather than farting around with more learning. I'm here to shoot things. If I wanted to learn things, I'd go back to school. Oh, hang on. Oh dear. Tutorials these days are really dry. Any charm or charisma that a game might be working with suddenly flies out the window because information must be passed on, and the only way of doing so is by playing things completely straight and serious. And you know what? That might be a good way of retaining information, but 5 minutes later, no one's going to remember what the hell you were talking about. And that's quite important. I'm not saying that every tutorial has to be funny, but I am saying that I'm more likely to pay attention to a tutorial if it's engaging. You can extend that to most things, including the very video that you're watching, but unlike a random YouTube video about good gaming tutorials, it's quite important that you pay attention to a tutorial if you want to have half a clue of what you're doing. Last year's Spider-Man was very intuitive and didn't require too much explanation beyond throwing you into downtown New York and letting you fling webs at every surface. But previous Spider-Man games didn't have this same level of trust in the player's intelligence. But what they did have was Bruce Campbell. And if you got Bruce Campbell, all you need to do is put him in charge of your game's tutorial and you're golden, my friend. Although you might have to do a bit more than that, since he also showed up in the third game, and this game has more glaring faults than its plot summary on Wikipedia has paragraphs. Fittingly, the Spider-Man 2 game, with all its qualities and an open world that Grand Theft Auto would be proud of, has the best tutorial section out of any of these games, as you boot it up for the first time and take in everything that this game has to offer. It's a tricky task when you're handling a sequel's tutorial, since you'll naturally have people playing who are around for the first time and don't need to be led so gently through the game's mechanics. So Bruce Campbell, as Mr. Narrator Guy, throws some jokes around and sarcasm to keep the wheels turning, as he does a really good job of explaining the fundamentals. It does make me smile, learning how to shot web by leaping off a building, everything slowing down, and Bruce Campbell being like, well, this is a fine pickle. The more I think about it, the more this style of tutorial makes sense, since this is technically based off of the second Spider-Man film from 2004, and that entire trilogy had a very enjoyably campy, light-hearted tone to it that this tutorial seems to be replicating very well. Even if you can now take Bruce Campbell out of context as he tells you to jump off a building, it's all downhill from here, no worries. You know how ads on YouTube are a stupid bad thing? They're not actually, they can be pretty handy for supporting the creators you love, but the reason why most people are able to put up with them these days is that you can skip them and continue on with your day as normal. It's a shame then that video game tutorials haven't taken to this idea in quite the same way yet. Off the top of my head, I can't think of too many occasions where a game is considerate enough to let you skip over a tutorial that is either superfluous or one that I've worked through many times before and can't be bothered with now. At times like this, I'm reminded of some advice that a friend once told me, which was, shut the fuck up and go play The Witcher 3. Do you know what? That man had a point. Honestly, you can come to The Witcher 3 with a multitude of problems and probably be alright on the other side. Are you lamenting the quality of open world games that can't match sheer size with any kind of consistency? We got you covered here with a sprawling odyssey of exciting action of an enthralling story that spreads to every corner of the land. With a setup like that, fumbling around with a tutorial would be seen as a misstep, so it comes as incredible news that The Witcher 3 frames its opening tutorial much like Modern Warfare 2 does, by letting you race a young Ciri across the castle ramparts and teach her the ins and outs of sword combat. On the grand scheme of things, this doesn't sound like much, and you're not a million miles wrong there, because what elevates The Witcher 3 above most other games is the socking great option to skip the fucking tutorial. This is an open world game with huge freedom of choice over what you do at the time and what kind of experiences you have. Being able to skip over the tutorial removes any hurdle you might have in the way of one day replaying The Witcher 3 in the future. I'm not going to say it's that easy, but it kind of is, really. Some of you who watched the negative version of this video when I talked about the worst tutorials in video games might be able to remember that I talked about The Witcher 2, which is basically the polar opposite to the third game. They don't really share much information with you, and then just kind of plop you down in the middle of a war zone and expect you to cope. So the third game is extra satisfying because it feels like you've got a chance in this wild world that you end up in. You know, Geralt always carries himself as this really confident warrior. I'd rather not play this game as a confused old man. You know what they say, Valve was a hell of a company and Portal is a hell of a drug. 2007 was a magical year for video games, but it also introduced the world to the entertainingly surreal world of Portal, with its snarky artificial intelligence GLaDOS keeping you company as you stumbled through mind-bending physics puzzles. This is Valve operating at their charming best. It also demonstrated how much fun a tutorial can be if you've got the right kind of guiding hand helping you, while also dripping in sarcasm as to make the whole experience just a bit more palatable. Portal 2 kept this tradition alive when Wheatley taught you to jump a few times for no apparent reason, but I reckon this kind of patronising tutorial wasn't properly realised until Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon came along 2 years after and made me feel like a sack of meat. Or at least more like a sack of meat than before. Before we get into it, it's important that you understand what kind of game Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon is. It's a spin-off that came out shortly after the 3rd Far Cry game, and even though the mainline series doesn't take itself super seriously, Blood Dragon is more of a parody of 80s action culture and this neon aesthetic, very colourful, very loud, very stupid, but very fun. It's set in the dystopian future of 2007. I mean, what more do you want to know? And if that wasn't enough of an indication of what kind of experience Far Cry Blood Dragon is promising, the opening tutorial very quickly spells that out for you. The message is very simple, since it is important that you know which buttons do what, but it's all this flavor text that keeps me going. I'll accept that maybe I do need to know how to look around and which buttons make me move my character, but the fact that Blood Dragon presents it in such a candid way makes it go down oh so smooth. So I said with Modern Warfare 2 that you don't need to be led through step-by-step instructions on how shooters work, and Blood Dragon knows this and revels in taking the piss by overselling what it's asking you to do. I live for being told to press C to challenge my sense of balance, or having running described as walking, but faster. And especially being told to subscribe to RabbidLuigi's YouTube channel and hit the bell because he needs numbers to prop up his bruised ego. Because YouTube is also one hell of a drug. Oh, I can't stop, I'm gonna die. Throw in there a protagonist who wants to get through to the end of the tutorial as soon as possible, and yeah, Blood Dragon has my attention right now at the start, and it keeps it for hours. I need more games powered by Cyborg Lube, it's clearly the secret ingredient. The elephant that has been patiently hiding in a corner of the room up until this point is the silent tutorial. There's probably a better name for it hiding somewhere in a dark corner of TV tropes, but I'm referring to any opening level in a game that teaches you how to play by letting you get on with things at your own speed. You don't have to take a seat in Video Game 101 and have information spoon-fed to you over a series of levels because, holy shit, sometimes you can learn by doing. Oh. I'm not including these because you could argue that this is just great level design and not really a typical representation of a tutorial, but luckily, there's a lot of middle grounds of this. And a couple of years ago, we got the best of the lot. And you can praise The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild for a multitude of unconnected reasons that all come together to make one of the best games from the last 10 years, but the way it uses the Great Plateau to ease the player into a gigantic open world full of possibilities is nothing short of genius. When you first take a peek at that map and see the world stretch out for miles in every direction, it's so easy to become overwhelmed at the sheer magnitude of this game, a magnitude that hasn't really been done in a Zelda game before. I mean, Wind Waker comes close, but it's not quite the same, it's just a lot of blue. This is what makes the Great Plateau so effective, since you're given the perfect micro-environment in which to learn and experiment with the vast majority of the mechanics in the game. Some of which were retained from previous Zelda games like Z-targeting, and others like climbing that are new to Breath of the Wild that have to be explored in a controlled environment. Fortunately, they've given you exactly that. The coolest thing about the Great Plateau is how it doesn't really feel like a tutorial. I mean, sure, you've still got the old man stalking you everywhere you go to share nuggets of knowledge about how the Sheikah Slate works and the significance of the shrines, but you can't understate how relieving it is to be able to get to grips with this game at a pace that feels comfortable to you. You're allowed to die in the Great Plateau. You can make mistakes because that's how you learn faster and more effectively. The first time through, you'll always be spending more time here than any subsequent playthrough as you try out game mechanics, but even on repeat playthroughs, you might find yourself changing up the order you beat the 4 shrines in, or get through the snowy area without the proper clothing, or just speedrun the hell out of it. Any tutorial where you can fly across the sky scores very high marks with me. This is RabbidLuigi, and the only negative point against the Great Plateau is that you can't skip over it. You can beat it pretty quickly, as many people have done in the past, but until you beat all 4 shrines you can't leave the area, and that does take time. It's never really bothered me though, because there's so many different routes through the Great Plateau and things you can do in different orders and certain little quests you can do, that it always felt like an organic experience every single time. It's a trait we see so often in so many other walks of gaming life. Why aren't more tutorials open world? Have you got a topic that you'd like me to talk about next week? Make sure you leave a comment about that down below, because I'll be taking the most interesting suggestions and making a poll on the next video. In fact, here's one right now that I prepared from last week. I'll be revealing the winner of the poll on Twitter and taking suggestions for games to talk about that are related to that topic. so feel free to follow me over there so we can keep in touch. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.